There's two critical things from the Tesla earnings call that a lot of people missed. One of them was a big change that people didn't understand, and one of them is some math that people just got wrong. Now, today, Tesla's robotaxi account announced that they're going to have a Cybercab launch event coming soon, and looks like it's going to be in September, if not sooner. The second thing we're going to talk about relates very closely to robotaxi, but the first one is about Tesla Cortex. In the slide deck for the Q1 and Q2 calls, Tesla started reporting the amount of compute that they have. And in Q1, they reported it as H100 equivalents. That's an NVIDIA chip. And in Q2, they reported it in megawatts. No explanation why. Nobody asked. Nobody talking about it. What you see here is, first of all, you have 100,000 H100Es equivalents, H100 equivalents, more than 100,000 in Cortex 1, and more than 130,000 in Cortex 2, which is growing early ramp. And you can see on the bottom, the chart shows a big jump in the amount of H100 equivalents spring of the year. That's future planned capacity, and that's an increase in H100 equivalents, and you go from about 150,000 to close to 300,000. So it's a doubling in H100 equivalents. And that sounds straightforward, but now let's look at what they showed in Q2. That jump materialized. It may not have been exactly what they projected, but they went from about 100 megawatts to about 250 megawatts, so roughly doubling in megawatts. And now they have a new plan to jump in compute by the end of the year that takes them to 400 megawatts. The difference matters because this jump is going from H100 chips to Blackwell chips. And Blackwell chips give you more tokens per watt, more compute per watt. And this one is probably a shift to Vera Rubin, which gives you even more compute per watt. The more advanced hardware does more AI for the same amount of watts. So if you're measuring an H100 equivalents, you have you have a way of looking at it. When you go to megawatts, these megawatts are more intelligent than these megawatts. And so Cortex, which is essentially training compute, there's some inference compute done at Cortex, but one of the key differences between Tesla's compute hardware in their data center and let's say Grok's, SpaceX XAI compute or anybody else's compute is they have training and they have inference compute on the same cluster. Now, Tesla does some inference on their data center on Cortex cluster, but the customer inference is done in the cars. If you do a query to Grok, if you prompt Grok and say, hey, blah, 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 that compute is done in the Colossus data center. It's not done on your computer. If you query ChatGPT, if you query Claude, whatever prompts you do, generally speaking, that inference compute is done in the data center cluster, and 2/3 to 80, 90% of compute in those clusters is inference compute, not training compute. Training compute is where the computer gets smarter. Inference compute is where it uses the smarts that it has. So customer inference is always done in the cars. There's a lot less inference compute done in the Cortex cluster, so most of this is training compute, and you're getting a lot more increase in training. If you go by megawatts and you say, okay, we went from 120 megawatts in the March of this year, and we're going to be at 400 megawatts, that's more than a tripling in megawatts. But when you take into account that the intelligence of, let's say, Vera Rubin chips is probably 4 to 5 times the training compute of an H100, you might really be talking about a 10x or more in actual compute. I've seen people complaining that it's not fair. Tesla's not expanding their data center compute when, SpaceX is getting all the compute. You're missing it. Tesla is constantly expanding inference compute by making more cars and selling more cars. And they're also expanding training compute much faster than you'd think because number one, this is a big jump in megawatts. And number two, it's a really big jump in intelligence to go from 120 megawatts to 400 megawatts. And the jump is smarter chips. You're talking about at least a 6x in intelligence based on a tripling in watts. Big deal. And what this means is, number one, you get faster and better training of the cars for robotaxi. And the really important thing for why you need all this training compute, because the robotaxi problem is almost solved, is being able to train Optimus. And this number is going to jump again in 2027. They're going to invest a lot more in compute, and it's going to be all Vera Rubin. And they may go to a gigawatt next year. And the intelligence of the compute might be a 20x on where they were now. And you need a lot of intelligence to train Optimus because Optimus is a much more complicated approach to real world AI. You have to manipulate objects where the cars don't manipulate objects, and you have to operate in more complex spaces. So, and then, the manipulation of objects is a very, very complicated thing. So they need a ton of compute to get Optimus ready to go. This probably already more than enough compute for robotaxi, but Optimus is coming, and this is why we're seeing this big jump. So let's go back to robotaxi and cybercab. The thing everyone seems to have missed from the Q2 earnings call, other than the change in how they measure compute, the other big thing people missed is Ashok described double-digit growth in robotaxi unsupervised miles per week. And a lot of people interpreted that as 10% weekly growth. You have it here, 10% weekly growth. I saw multiple people referring to it as 10% because Ashok said double digit. And the math doesn't math. So I'm sorry, I'm not normally a spreadsheet guy, but today we're doing spreadsheets. And let's assume that the first week of unsupervised robotaxi was 500 miles. I'm going to show you the next chart is 1,000 miles. How many miles of unsupervised robotaxi driving was there in the first week that they were operating robotaxi, which was January 22nd, 2026 is the first day of it. So I'm going to start with 500 miles. And now you have the next question is what's the growth rate? So I've given you 3 different pairs of columns here for the growth rate. If you go to 10%, what you'll see is on July 23rd, 2026, and by the way, some of the rows are hidden because otherwise this thing would be way too long. July 23rd, 2026, you would have 60,000 cumulative miles at a 10% growth rate. If you start at 1,000 miles, you'd be at 120,000. And the problem is, as Ashok said, that we're at 380,000 cumulative miles driven. So the number of miles you'd have to have in the first week of the year that unsupervised robotaxi is operating would have to be way higher than 1,000 miles. It would have to be 3,000, 4,000 miles in order to make the 10% growth rate work. So 10% doesn't make sense. 500 miles might be optimistic about how many miles unsupervised robotaxi drove in the first week, but let's start with 500 miles. At a 15% growth rate, the 27th week, you'd be at 141,000 cumulative miles. Still not enough to reach the 380,000 that Ashok talked about. At a 20% growth rate, you'd be at 340,000. So 20% growth rate is probably closer to the truth than 10%. I don't know why people jumped on 10% as the idea. If you're doing double digits, could be 99%, it could be 10%. I think 20% is a happy medium. Maybe it's 15%, but you can see on the numbers here, it's hard to make it work with even as low as 15%. Because even if you double that to 1,000 miles, which I'll show you next, you still don't get to 380,000 cumulative miles. So what does that mean for when robotaxi reaches the number that I think is magical? The magical number is 10,000 miles a week. If you do 10,000 miles a week, you're at 500 million miles a year. And 500 million miles a year, if you're making $1 profit a mile, is $500 million a year in gross profit. And that's enough to get on the financial statements. In the medium future, you've got 10 million robotaxis generating massive profits, and the numbers are crazy. But just getting to that 10 million miles probably gets you in the financial statements with a revenue line and a cost of goods sold line. And then the Wall Street types can start to do math out and say, where's this going to be in a couple of years? And that's when the stock really starts to take off. If you're growing at a 20% per week growth rate, you hit 11 million miles, you pass 10 million miles somewhere in February of 2027. So that's first quarter of 2027. And it gets reported in April. And that's when the stock starts to take off. That's a theory. If it's only a 15% growth rate, then you end up with 10 million miles in June of 2027. Shows up in the Q3 and the Q2 financials in July. If it's only a 10% growth rate, you have to wait until January of 2028, which is Q1 of 2028, and you don't find out until April of 2028. I think that's unreasonably pessimistic. Again, I think the 10% number just doesn't work. It doesn't get you to 380,000 cumulative miles, and it puts off the commercial success of robotaxi far longer than makes sense. Just to look at the numbers, starting with 1,000, you're basically just doubling, but you can see if you go 15% in the week that they had the earnings call, you would only be at 280,000 cumulative miles. It's not enough to reach the number that Ashok said. At 20%, if you started at 1,000 miles, you'd be over. So 20% is too generous if they were already done, if they did 1,000 miles in the first week. I think 500 miles is a lot closer. I think the 20% number is a lot more likely. If you're at the 20% number and you started at 1,000, you'd be at 10 million miles in January of 2027 instead of February 2027. It's a really big deal what the rate is because the faster they're increasing per week, the faster you get to 10 million miles, the faster you get to 500, 10 million robo taxis, etc. It's possible that the growth rate slows down. It's also possible that the growth rate accelerates, especially if they're going to have a robo taxi launch event with Cybercab. That could be a big deal. So if you do 15% starting at the 1,000 miles per week, you get to 10 million miles in April of 2027. It's Q2 of 2027. It's reported in July of 2027. One of my predictions has been we're going to see this hit the financials and we're going to see the stock start to take off by July of 2027. And both of these analysis, you end up with, yeah, it's probably got to be by July of 2027. January 2027 looks unlikely on these numbers. But April of 2027, July of 2027 is where you start to see robotaxi really taking off. This assumes that the robotaxi rate of growth doesn't increase. I'm much more comfortable saying that 90% certainty we're going to see robotaxi scale to the point where it shows up in the financials and it starts driving up the stock price by July of 2027, and a strong chance that it's by April of 2027. I still think there's an outside chance that something good happens and we see it by December of 2026, and it shows up in the Q4 financials in January of 2027. But on these numbers, I think that's looking a little optimistic. I had put it at 50-50. Now I'm saying that's like a 25% chance. But with the Cybercab launch, maybe everything changes. First slowly, then all at once. Maybe all at once is coming by the end of this year. I don't know. They're putting a lot of Cybercabs in a lot of places. And once they start running cybercabs and they launch cybercabs, maybe they increase unsupervised robotaxi a lot. Because I don't think there's really a prospect for having supervised robotaxi in cybercab. If they don't have steering wheels, who's supervising? Just a quick note that I did a video for supporters today. YouTube channel members, ex-subscribers, and Patreon supporters got access to this video where I go through my personal portfolio, where my portfolio stands now, and the changes that I'm making to it in the near future. Talked about a couple other things, but this is the big deal. If you want to know how my portfolio is structured now and where I'm heading, please become a YouTube channel member, ex-subscriber, or Patreon supporter to get access to those videos. And I make a lot of videos about Tesla long call options or long call options for AI stocks and some other content. Thank you so much for watching.